Part 1. After the trumpets faded. Hey guys. Tonight, we're wandering back to the quieter side of medieval warfare. Not the clashing swords, not the glorious banners, not the endless "for God and King" speeches. We're talking about what happened after all that noise stopped. After the trumpets went quiet. After the banners were trampled into mud. After the war was well and truly lost. Because for the ordinary medieval soldier, and even some of the unlucky nobles, losing a war wasn't a single event. It was a long, awkward, sometimes tragic fade-out. It didn't end with the credits rolling. It ended with a few bad decisions, a handful of lice, and a lot of walking home without shoes. So, dim the lights, get comfortable. Maybe imagine yourself sitting by a dying campfire somewhere in 14th century France. The wind smells like smoke and wet wool, and you've just realized that the army you joined, the one you were so sure was going to win, is currently running for its life. Let's begin there. The battlefield hangover. Losing a battle in the Middle Ages was messy. And I don't mean messy in the emotional sense. I mean physically, mud everywhere, people screaming. No one knows who's in charge messy. When an army broke, there was no orderly retreat. No polite, "All right, gentlemen, let's reconvene at the inn." It was a total collapse. Imagine 10,000 men suddenly deciding that every man for himself was the new official military strategy. For many, that moment when the line broke was when their military career ended. Some were cut down trying to flee. Others threw away armor, shields, and even swords to run faster. And yes, if you were wondering, armor was expensive, so throwing it away was like a medieval version of burning your car to outrun traffic. But panic makes people weird. The lucky ones, the ones who could slip away into forests or villages, faced a new problem, surviving the aftermath. The spoils of losing. So, you're a medieval soldier. You've survived the battle somehow. Congratulations. Statistically speaking, that's already impressive. Now what? Well, first, you're broke. Because armies back then didn't really do pensions. If you were part of a feudal levy, your lord might have promised pay or land. But that was only if the lord himself wasn't currently lying face down in the mud somewhere. Spoiler, a lot of them were. Professional mercenaries, the few who made a living out of this, had it even worse. They might have been hired by a king or a duke, but when that king loses, the first thing he stops doing is paying the mercenaries, which meant they had two options: wander off and try to find someone else to hire them, or just not wander off and start looting whoever was nearby. And this is how you get those charming little groups called free companies. Basically, bands of unemployed soldiers who decided to keep doing what they were good at, killing and stealing, just without the official war part. Between the 1350s and 1400s, Europe was crawling with these guys. They'd move from village to village, eating everything, burning what they didn't eat, and calling themselves God's instruments of justice, which, was medieval for "we're robbing you, don't resist." Even kings had to negotiate with them sometimes, literally paying them not to destroy towns. Imagine losing a war so badly that you have to bribe your own ex-soldiers to go away. Prisoners of bad fortune. If you weren't quick enough to run, you might get captured. And being captured in medieval warfare wasn't always terrible if you were rich. See, nobles treated other nobles like walking bags of gold. Capture the right knight, and you could ransom him for a fortune. So, if you were wearing expensive armor and had a fancy title, you might actually survive, get taken to a nice castle, and be fed well while someone negotiated your release. It was practically a business arrangement. But if you were a poor infantryman, let's just say nobody was writing home to pay your ransom. You had no market value, so depending on the captor's mood, you might be used as forced labor, sold off as a servant, or simply removed from the equation. A few chroniclers like to brag about mercy, stories of knights sparing common soldiers, but most of those stories were written by knights, for knights, and about knights. So, take that as you will. There's even a record from the 100 Years' War where English soldiers joked about thinning out the French prisoners so they wouldn't have to feed them on the march home. Charming stuff. The road home, if there was one. Let's say you escaped capture. You're still alive. That's good. But now you have to get home. Assuming you still have one. Travel was dangerous. Roads were bad. And food was scarce. Armies moved through regions like locusts, stripping everything edible. So once the army dissolved, so did its food supply. A lot of returning soldiers ended up as beggars, bandits, or drifters. And remember, medieval Europe wasn't exactly bursting with charity. If you showed up in a village with no coin, no lord, and no explanation, people assumed you were a thief or a spy. Some joined monasteries, not out of devotion, but out of sheer exhaustion. A lifetime of plowing fields suddenly looked pretty good after months of living off cold turnips and mud. Others, especially the ones missing limbs or eyes, became part of a grim, unspoken underclass, the permanently displaced. The medieval world didn't really have a veteran support system. Your trauma was just called being cursed, or needing confession. Noble losers. The high-end tragedy. Of course, not everyone who lost was a peasant. Let's float over to the noble end of the misery scale. Losing nobles had their own set of problems. Fancier, but still awful. A captured noble could be ransomed, yes, but that often meant years of captivity while families scrambled to pay. And if your family couldn't afford it, you'd die in someone else's castle, surrounded by people pretending to be polite about it. There's the famous example of John II of France, captured by the English in 1356. He was treated like a VIP prisoner. Silk sheets, banquets, all that. But he still spent years in England, bleeding France dry through ransom payments. When he was finally allowed to return home, he found out his son had messed up the payments. So John, in a move that was both noble and absolutely insane, voluntarily went back to England to honor his word. He died there, from stress and probably a complete lack of sense. So yes, even royal losers didn't always get happy endings. The long shadow of defeat. Defeat lingered. In medieval Europe, war wasn't just about killing. It was about honor. And losing meant dishonor, not just for the soldiers, but for entire families, regions, even generations. That shame was heavy. Knights who survived a humiliating defeat might take vows of pilgrimage or penance. Some even joined crusades later, hoping to wash away their bad record with a holy war. Because nothing says, "I feel bad," like going to fight someone completely unrelated in the Middle East. But for the common soldiers, defeat just meant fading back into anonymity. They returned home with scars, strange diseases, and sometimes other people's armor, hoping nobody asked too many questions. Their war stories became half-forgotten tavern talk, and when they died, no one wrote it down. When losing became a career. Here's a fun twist. Some men made a living out of losing. Not intentionally, but practically speaking. Mercenaries in the later Middle Ages realized that loyalty was flexible. If your employer lost the war, well, there was always another desperate duke somewhere needing bodies. So they'd swap sides, change banners, and pretend they'd always been fighting for that team. This made medieval politics even messier. At least 2 major battles in the 100 Years' War featured soldiers who had literally fought on both sides at different points, which honestly sounds like a scheduling nightmare. It also led to endless accusations of treason, betrayal, and cowardice. But really, they were just trying not to starve. And who could blame them? The church's take: sin, suffering, and shrugging. You might wonder, what did the church say about all this? After all, the church had opinions about everything. Officially, war was supposed to be just. If you lost, maybe it meant God didn't approve of your cause. Or maybe he just liked the other guy better that day. Priests would tell soldiers to confess, to do penance, and to thank God for survival. But behind all the sermons, there was an unspoken understanding. War was profitable. Defeat wasn't the end of the world. It was just another round of divine bookkeeping. Monasteries sometimes took in ex-soldiers as laborers or guards, and some bishops even hired defeated mercenaries as security, which, if you think about it, is kind of poetic. Lose a war, end up guarding a church. Talk about a career pivot, fading into the fog. Most soldiers' stories just vanished. No records, no gravestones, no songs. They simply dissolved into the landscape, back into farms, forests, and forgotten corners. Sometimes they reappeared decades later as vague ghosts in local legends. The wandering knight, the one-eyed man who never spoke, the soldier who came home in another man's armor, all fragments of real people who lived through defeats that the history books summarized in one sentence. Because history loves winners. Losers, not so much. And that's where we'll pause for now. In the next part, we'll drift into the stories of a few specific medieval losers, real soldiers and knights who lost wars, survived the humiliation, and tried to patch their lives back together in the weirdest ways possible. So, take a breath, maybe stretch, and when you're ready, we'll quietly step into the lives of men who learned that losing the war was only the beginning. Part 2. Living with defeat. Hey again. So, the battle's over, the banners are gone, and the crows have moved in. Now it's just the awkward part, figuring out what comes after. Tonight, we'll follow a few of those people who didn't die heroes or rise as kings. They just kept existing, half-starved, half-forgotten, and fully done with the whole honor and glory thing. Because losing a medieval war wasn't a single disaster. It was a slow unraveling, a very long, very muddy lesson in humility. Let's start with one of my favorite categories of historical losers, the soldiers of France after the Battle of Poitiers, 1356. The Poitiers. Problem. When everything fell apart. The Battle of Poitiers was one of those moments where history doesn't just trip, it faceplants. The French had numbers, knights, and confidence. The English had longbows, a grumpy prince, and terrible weather. It ended, predictably, with the French army collapsing. Their king, John II, was captured. Thousands were killed, captured, or scattered. And for the average French soldier who survived, the next few weeks were basically a medieval version of try not to get murdered on your way home. Those who could walk fled south or east, stealing food, sleeping in barns, pretending to be pilgrims. Some tossed away their armor and dressed like peasants. Others joined whatever band of survivors they could find, forming ragtag companies that wandered aimlessly until someone offered them coin. Except no one had coin. So they did what unemployed men with swords usually do. They started robbing people. This is when we see the rise of the tarred Venus, literally the latecomers. Basically, groups of ex-soldiers who missed the war but decided to show up for the looting anyway. They roamed France through the 1360s, torching villages, demanding ransoms from towns, and calling it God's work. Imagine 10,000 men wandering around Burgundy with weapons, complaining about back pay, and you've got the general idea. The French crown tried to pay them off, bribe them, or ship them somewhere else. At one point, they were literally sent on a crusade to Spain, not because anyone cared about Spain, but because the French just wanted them gone. Spoiler, they didn't make it. Half of them died on the way. The rest melted into the countryside, probably still arguing about whose fault Poitiers was. Sir John Hawkwood, the professional loser who kept winning. Now, not every defeated soldier ended up robbing chickens in Burgundy. Some of them turned losing into an actual career path. Enter Sir John Hawkwood, the most famous English mercenary of the 14th century. He fought in the 100 Years' War, switched sides a few times, lost more battles than anyone could count, and somehow still managed to retire rich. After one particularly bad campaign, Hawkwood realized England wasn't paying, France wasn't hiring, and peace was terrible for business. So he took his company of unemployed men and marched to Italy, where every city-state was perpetually fighting every other city-state. Florence, Milan, Pisa, the Papal States, they all needed mercenaries, and Hawkwood was very available. The Italians called him Giovanni Acuto, which sounds fancy, but basically means John the Sharp. Sharp like clever, or sharp like probably steals silverware. His men, known as the White Company, were infamous for showing up, demanding outrageous pay, and occasionally switching sides mid-battle. You know, depending on who paid faster. It sounds dishonorable, but honestly, they were professionals in a system that treated them as disposable. If you've already fought for a king who forgot your name after the campaign, loyalty becomes more of a suggestion. Hawkwood's story shows that some medieval soldiers learned to surf defeat like a wave. Lose one war, sell your services in the next. And when people start calling you a villain, just point out that they hired you last week. Crécy's forgotten foot soldiers. Let's step back a little. Before Poitiers, there was Crécy in 1346. Another English win, another French disaster. But this time, we'll focus on the guys nobody writes poems about, the ordinary foot soldiers. Most of them weren't professionals. They were farmers, pressed into service by their lords. They got a spear, a bit of training, and a vague promise that the glory of France would somehow translate into food. It didn't. After Crécy, entire regions of northern France were left stripped bare. Families waited for men who never came back. Those who did return often brought plague, injuries, or the kind of silence that comes from seeing too much. The chronicles say the French nobility blamed cowardice among the lower ranks. Because of course they did. It couldn't possibly be the fault of arrogant nobles charging uphill into English longbows. But here's the quiet truth. Most of the men who survived Crécy didn't go home as soldiers. They went home as cripples, beggars, and permanent reminders that war wasn't a glorious thing. It was just a mess people kept walking back into. The English losers. When the invaders get invaded now, England loved to brag about winning medieval wars, but eventually the tables turned. Let's float to the late 15th century, the Wars of the Roses, a time when English nobles basically decided to reenact every French disaster. But at home, ordinary soldiers fought not for nations, but for whichever noble fed them that month. When their side lost, there were no foreign lands to flee to, just angry neighbors and burned villages. At Towton in 1461, one of the bloodiest battles in English history, thousands died in snow and mud. When it was over, survivors fled north, hiding in forests or pretending to be peasants again. Some Yorkists and Lancastrians switched sides so many times that nobody remembered who'd been loyal to whom. It was a perfect example of medieval moral flexibility. If you lost a war in France, you could vanish into another country. But if you lost one at home, you just disappeared. The disbanded, Europe's unwanted guests. As wars dragged on and off for centuries, Europe ended up with an enormous population of ex-soldiers, some crippled, some old, some simply tired of being yelled at by people with better armor. They had no pensions, no property, and often no legal place in society. Many became masterless men, a term so scary to medieval authorities that entire laws were written to control them. In France, England, and the Empire, vagrancy laws popped up everywhere. If you were caught wandering without papers, you could be branded, imprisoned, or just hanged for disturbing the peace. So yes, lose a war, lose your job, lose your freedom. Meanwhile, those who had fought for the church's wars, crusaders and holy soldiers, sometimes ended up worse off because the church loved to promise salvation, but not housing. A returned crusader might have scars, PTSD, though they didn't call it that, and a strong sense that God owed them something. God, however, did not have a refund policy. When kings lose, too, sometimes the loser wasn't the soldier at all. It was the king. And when kings lost, everyone beneath them paid the bill. Take Richard II of England, for example. Deposed, imprisoned, and left to starve. Probably murdered, but gently, of course. His loyal soldiers, the ones who'd followed him in France, were stripped of land and titles. Many just vanished into obscurity, replaced by men who'd backed the new regime, or King Charles the Bold of Burgundy, ambitious, dramatic, and not very good at staying alive. After his death at Nancy in 1477, his army disintegrated overnight. Thousands of Burgundian troops were left stranded in hostile territory. Some tried to reach the Holy Roman Empire. Others melted into Swiss villages pretending to be laborers. A few were hunted down by the victorious Swiss, who had a strict no Burgundians allowed policy that mostly involved axes. The men who followed kings like Charles had to reinvent themselves every time their boss died. Lose one duke, find another. It was less about loyalty and more about job security, which, in medieval Europe, was always terrible. Knights without causes. You'd think knights, with their fancy titles and horse insurance, had it better. Not always. By the late Middle Ages, knighthood was expensive and increasingly pointless. Armies were shifting toward cheaper, better-trained infantry and professional mercenaries. So when a knight's lord lost a war, the knight didn't just lose his income, he lost his relevance. Some took to tournament circuits, showing off at mock battles for money. Others tried to marry rich widows, which was its own form of economic warfare. And quite a few simply retired early, selling off armor and quietly joining monasteries. The most pitiable were the landless knights, the men who'd fought bravely for a cause that no longer existed. Some turned bandit, some became guards for merchants, a humiliating step down for someone once called Sir. A few even ended up as executioners, still swinging blades, just for different reasons. When losers built empires. Strangely enough, some of Europe's greatest explorers, colonizers, and adventurers were losers. Former mercenaries, disbanded knights, or noblemen who'd backed the wrong side. They had nothing left at home, so they went abroad. Portuguese and Spanish expansion in the 15th century was partly fueled by these displaced warriors, men looking for fresh fights and easy fortunes. It's ironic, really. Europe's obsession with war created so many losers that they had to leave the continent entirely just to keep fighting somewhere else. So, in a twisted way, losing wars at home helped Europe win wars abroad, or at least new ones. The quiet endings. Not every story ended with drama. Most ended quietly, somewhere on a nameless road, in a nameless village, beside a nameless river. A broken man, missing a few fingers, telling half-true war stories to people who'd stopped listening. Sometimes they'd trade their old armor for bread, their sword for a roof. A few lucky ones lived long enough to see another war start, and wisely stayed home this time. The chronicles almost never mention them, because medieval history loved to write about kings, not carpenters with scars. But if you listen closely, in letters, in wills, in random tax records, you find traces. John of Hereford, lame in one leg. Pierre, once a man-at-arms, now a tanner. Tiny echoes of those who lost everything, but kept living anyway. And maybe that's the real ending here. Not glory, not redemption, just endurance. And that's where we'll rest for tonight. In part 3, we'll float deeper into the emotional side. How soldiers, knights, and kings actually coped with losing. How shame, superstition, and survival intertwined in medieval minds. And how defeat slowly became a kind of strange, sacred experience. Half sin, half therapy. So, for now, close your eyes. Picture the fog on an empty field. The war is over. And somewhere in that silence, a soldier starts walking home. Part 3. Ghosts who kept walking. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've survived 2 full parts of medieval hopelessness. If you're half asleep, that's fine too. That's kind of the point. Tonight, we're not marching anywhere. We're just lingering in the quiet space after the battles, where soldiers, nobles, and kings tried to make sense of what had just happened. When the banners were gone and the prayers had stopped echoing, there was still the question nobody wanted to ask. How do you live with losing? Shame, the medieval companion losing, wasn't only bad luck. It was considered a moral failure. God had clearly taken the other side, which meant he'd also taken a personal interest in your humiliation. Chroniclers loved writing lines like, "God smote the proud," which was a polite way of saying, "You guys embarrassed yourselves," and heaven agreed. For nobles, this kind of shame could linger for generations. Families rewrote genealogies to pretend their grandfathers hadn't fled the battlefield. Coats of arms quietly disappeared from records, and a few knights, too proud to bear it, went on pilgrimage. That word covered everything from hiking to Jerusalem to vanishing forever into some monastery that didn't ask questions. The church didn't exactly help. Priests would give sermons about divine punishment, pointing out that a lost war proved everyone's sins had gotten out of hand. So instead of therapy, soldiers got guilt. Lots of it. Confession and convenient. Forgetting. One of the most popular medieval coping mechanisms was confession. Not necessarily for the soul, more like free group therapy with incense. Men would line up to unload the weight of things they'd done in battle. The looting, the killing, the occasional accidental church burning. Priests listened, absolved, and moved on. But there was no follow-up session, no, "How are you feeling now?" So, soldiers learned the fine art of selective memory. They'd tell the parts that sounded noble, skip the messy ones, and convince themselves that silence counted as redemption. And maybe it did, at least enough to sleep. Those who couldn't forget often dreamed instead. Chroniclers mention knights waking up screaming, convinced they heard drums again. The medieval solution? More prayer or wine, usually both. Pilgrims with swords. Some men tried to turn defeat into holiness. If you couldn't win a war for your king, maybe you could win one for God. Enter the penitential pilgrim soldier. Picture a man in rust-stained mail walking barefoot to Santiago or Rome. muttering psalms and regretting everything. These pilgrimages weren't just religious acts, they were social resets. Lose your fortune in war. Walk 1,000 miles and call it character development. A few even joined later crusades, technically a chance to redeem past losses. Of course, most crusades went just as badly, but at least now you were losing spiritually. The line between devotion and avoidance was blurry. Some truly sought forgiveness. Others just needed to believe that all the blood had meant something. The veterans' homecoming that nobody asked for. For peasants who'd been drafted, homecoming could be awkward. Villages didn't always welcome back men who'd learned to kill for a living. Too many stories of soldiers turning violent, stealing, or spreading disease. Records from English manorial courts show returning men fined for disturbing the peace, basically yelling war stories after curfew. A few were accused of witchcraft because apparently surviving France was suspicious. But most veterans just blended in again. They went back to ploughing, mending roofs, and pretending they hadn't once been standing knee-deep in someone else's mistake. When neighbors asked what the war had been like, they'd shrug and say, loud. And that was that. Coping by coin. If prayer didn't fix you, maybe money would. Victorious kings loved to hand out tiny pensions, the medieval equivalent of thoughts and prayers, but in coin form. Losers rarely got those. Still, a few clever ex-soldiers turned trauma into business. They became military instructors, teaching noble sons how not to repeat their mistakes. Some opened fencing schools, where half the lessons were about honor and the other half about avoiding debt collectors. And then there were the storytellers, former soldiers who wandered taverns selling exaggerated versions of their failures. Add a dragon here, a miracle there, and suddenly defeat sounded heroic. You could say they invented medieval clickbait, faith, fear, and friendly superstition. After losing wars, people looked for cosmic explanations. Clearly someone had angered a saint. So relics got cleaned, processions marched, and the air filled with the sound of bells. Basically, medieval crisis management. For soldiers, superstition became personal. Many carried charms, bits of bone, scraps of parchment, saints' medallions. If you'd survived a massacre, you assumed the charm worked. If you hadn't, well, nobody asked you. Some prayed to obscure saints with oddly specific resumes. Saint Barbara for sudden death, Saint Sebastian for arrows, Saint Christopher for long walks home. You could almost imagine a celestial help desk, constantly overbooked after every failed campaign. The silent epidemic. We can't really diagnose medieval trauma, but it's hard to miss. Chroniclers talk about melancholy, visions, and madness of the returning men. Symptoms we'd now call PTSD were treated with prayer, fasting, or exorcism, depending on which priest you got. One English source from the early 15th century mentions men who wake screaming and strike their wives thinking the enemy is upon them. The scribe added, they are possessed by war, which honestly is as accurate a phrase as any. A few monasteries quietly took these men in, calling them God's broken instruments. They were gardens, copied manuscripts, and occasionally forgot their own names. And for once, the silence was healing. When kings needed therapy, 2 even rulers weren't immune. Take Henry VI of England, technically a loser by default, since he lost his sanity before his crown. After years of civil war, he slipped into what we'd now call catatonia. People whispered that it was punishment for the bloodshed of the Wars of the Roses, or maybe just hereditary anxiety mixed with centuries of bad breeding. French King Charles VI, same century, different meltdown. One day, he simply decided his bones were glass and refused to let anyone touch him. Losing wars against the English didn't help. Courtiers patted his furniture and pretended everything was fine, which, to be fair, is still how most governments handle mental health. These kings remind us that even at the top, defeat leaked inward. You could hide losses with gold, but not with sleep, the church of amnesia. Over time, everyone developed a collective coping mechanism, forgetting. The church helped by turning defeats into mysteries of God's will. Chroniclers politely edited events, converting humiliations into tests of faith. And the people, they just stopped talking about them. When you read medieval annals, the pattern's clear. Battle of something, lost. Quick apology, next topic. It's like scrolling past an embarrassing old photo. That silence was its own kind of healing. If nobody mentions it, maybe it never happened. Art as aftercare. Interestingly, some of the most peaceful medieval art came right after terrible wars. Those calm Madonnas, serene saints, golden mosaics, all painted by people trying to remember what still felt pure. Patrons funded chapels in thanks for deliverance, which usually meant we survived the losing side. Tapestries, too, were a form of therapy. They rewove chaos into pattern. Knights, banners, symmetry, everything under control again. A neat little lie you could hang on a wall. The long sleep. By the 15th century, Europe was exhausted. Centuries of fighting, losing, rebuilding, and pretending it all meant something. Out of that fatigue grew a strange wisdom. That rest was holy. Monks began writing about the virtue of stillness, of holy idleness. Not sloth, just peace. And in a way, those writings were for everyone who'd ever stumbled back from a lost war. A whispered permission to stop marching. The final drift. So what did happen to medieval soldiers after losing a war? Some starved, some stole, some prayed until their voices gave out. A few turned loss into legend, others into silence. Most just carried on, slower, sadder, and a little wiser. If you could see them now, walking home through misty fields, armor dented, thoughts heavy, they'd probably look less like heroes and more like ghosts. Not haunting the world, exactly. Just still here, waiting for it to calm down. And that's where we'll stop for tonight. If you're still awake, thank you for keeping them company. If you're already asleep, that's even better. They'd probably approve. Next time, we'll drift toward another quiet corner of history. Maybe how executioners or royal widows learn to live with their own kinds of loss. But for now, close your eyes. Let the campfires fade and rest like a soldier who finally made it home. Part 4. The Echoes of Defeat. Hey again, you're still here. That's impressive. By now, you've probably forgotten what century we're in, which is fine. Time in the Middle Ages didn't really move forward anyway. It just sort of looped. Tonight, we're wrapping up our slow march through what happens after losing. Not the battles themselves, but the ripples they leave behind. The songs, the stories, and the quiet ways people remembered without saying so. So, pull the blanket a little higher. Let's drift through the memory of medieval defeat. Soft, slow, and almost at peace with itself. Memory by candlelight. If you've ever read a medieval chronicle, you might notice something strange. They rarely sound angry, even the losing ones. There's this calm, almost polite resignation, as if history were a weather report written by monks. The king advanced. The battle was lost. Many were slain. God's will be done. It's not detachment, it's survival. The chronicler knew that every word might one day be read by the winners, so he wrote like a man keeping his head down in a crowded church, pretending to pray. And yet, between the lines, there's always that tone, a sigh, a pause, the hint of disbelief that all this blood was really worth so little. You can feel it most in the margins. Little notes like, "I was there," or "God forgive us." Tiny whispers of witness, trapped in Latin abbreviations. The songs of the losers. Oddly enough, losing made for better art. Victories were loud, temporary, full of parades. But losses, those stuck around, hummed quietly in the dark. Medieval ballads are full of defeat that somehow sounds comforting. Knights dying nobly, kings forgiving their enemies, women waiting by windows that never open. They turned heartbreak into lullabies. You could hum along and pretend the ending wasn't the point. In France, after the 100 Years' War, wandering singers, jongleurs, carried songs of fallen lords and broken towns. They didn't name names, just moods, grey skies, long roads, a sense that home was somewhere behind the smoke. And in England, soldiers brought back fragments of French tunes, humming them in alehouses without knowing the words. Half-forgotten melodies about loss reshaped into drinking songs, a kind of emotional recycling, medieval style. Chronicles, myths, and a little bit of denial. When entire kingdoms lost, the chroniclers got creative. The trick was to make defeat look destined. Like, sure, the army was crushed, but only because God was setting up a greater plan. So you get these incredible mental gymnastics. England loses France? Well, maybe it was never meant to have it. A noble dies pointlessly. It's a divine test of courage. A plague wipes out half the army. That's just character development for the survivors. By the time these stories reached the next generation, the losing side sounded noble, misunderstood, and slightly magical. Defeat became myth, polished, poetic, and painless. And honestly, that's how most of history survives, as a story someone told softly enough that you could fall asleep before the sad part came back. The monastic archives of forgetting deep in monasteries, the official record keepers, monks, handled loss differently. Their job was to preserve documents, but also to decide what not to preserve. And that's where the real magic happened. Entire campaigns disappeared from archives because some tired monk just didn't copy them again. Wars faded, names blurred, and shame dissolved into dust between vellum pages. Not through conspiracy, just through exhaustion. Imagine the scene. A scriptorium lit by candles. A monk yawning over parchment, deciding that maybe that lost battle in 1322 wasn't worth the ink. That's how oblivion happens. Not with fire, but with boredom, the economy of losing. And here's the practical side. Because even sorrow has a budget. When kings lost wars, they owed a lot of people a lot of money. Mercenaries, armorers, suppliers, everyone. So post-war Europe became a continent of unpaid debts and disappointed blacksmiths. The English crown, for instance, defaulted so many times that bankers in Florence actually banned lending to them. Medieval credit scores weren't numbers. They were rumors. If your reputation stank of defeat, nobody sold you arrows again. But here's the funny thing. Losing wars built economies. Ruined castles needed rebuilding. Armies needed new equipment. And peasant labor, once nearly worthless, suddenly mattered again because half the workforce had died. Defeat was terrible, but profitable in a weird, delayed way. It's like the whole continent learned the art of losing forward. The philosophy of failure. By the late Middle Ages, a quiet philosophy took root, that suffering and defeat might actually be good for the soul. Writers like Thomas à Kempis and Jean Gerson talked about holy humility, the idea that peace came not from winning, but from accepting that you wouldn't. Is the spiritual version of, maybe this was fine. Knights started keeping prayer books instead of just swords. Kings built chapels instead of fortresses. And literature began to sound less like propaganda and more like therapy. It's no coincidence that this was the same century Europe discovered pillow books, manuscripts of private reflections. The medieval world was learning to write down its feelings quietly under candlelight. Defeat as identity. Whole nations began to build identities around their losses. Scotland, after endless wars with England, turned every failed rebellion into legend. France, humiliated by the English in the early 100 Years' War, later celebrated Joan of Arc as a symbol of divine revenge, because she finally flipped the script. Even Spain, long before unification, carried centuries of defeats against Muslim rulers, slowly turning them into fuel for the Reconquista. You could say Europe's self-esteem was forged entirely out of failure, hammered into pride by repetition, the generational amnesia. Still, most soldiers never made it into those stories. Their defeats were personal, unrecorded. They disappeared into generations that simply didn't talk about it. You can almost picture it. A grandfather by the hearth, staring at the fire while his grandchildren play knights, pretending to win. He doesn't correct them. He just watches the flames, quietly remembering how losing really feels. That silence is history too. The parts we never wrote down. 1,000 sleepy ghosts. If you travel through Europe today, you'll find little things that whisper of old defeats. A hill called Dead Man's Field, a half-buried sword in a church wall, a coat of arms with the colors faded wrong. They're not memorials, just echoes. And if you stand still long enough, maybe you can hear them. Not moaning ghosts, just tired footsteps. A reminder that losing didn't end lives. It filled them with a kind of quiet wisdom that never made it into books. Those soldiers didn't vanish. They became part of the landscape, part of the silence you feel in ancient ruins, or in the cold echo of a castle hall after the tourists leave. The long piece. By the Renaissance, Europe finally began to shift its obsession. New weapons, new politics, new dreams of discovery. But underneath the Renaissance glitter was still the medieval ache, the inherited fatigue of too many pointless wars. The artists painted light because their ancestors had lived in shadow. They painted serenity because they remembered panic. Peace was not just an ideal. It was the reward for surviving centuries of losing. And so, the medieval soldier, nameless, forgotten, became the foundation of modern calm. Every field of wheat in Europe grew over his memory. Every quiet town square once echoed with his defeat. And maybe, just maybe, every time you close your eyes to sleep, some part of that silence is his, drifting away. So, that's the story. What happened to medieval soldiers after losing a war? They went home, they wandered, they prayed, they forgot, and in a way, they built the world that came next, a quieter, wiser one. If you're still awake, take a slow breath. If you're not, that's fine. Some stories are meant to end in sleep. Let the candles burn low. The battlefield's long gone, and history, for once, has nothing left to fight for. Good night. Rest well. You've survived the Middle Ages.